So, then at 6, the CLI calls. Dheeraj and Timothy shall break down the walls from the command line deployment or from your desk. A powerful tool, so simple and fresh. If I can read it properly. I've been going for many hours. The adrenaline's starting to wear off. I'm sorry, people.
You're doing great, Stace.
But yes, it's nearly 6 o'clock. This is the last session that we have of the day with instructional content. And the last 2 sessions are going to be real-world examples of how this was used, trials, tribulations, and how to make it do cool stuff in the real world. So without further ado, let's invite our 2 speakers to the stage. We have Timothy and we have Dheeraj. Dheeraj, am I pronouncing your name correctly? I apologize if I'm not.
No, you are, yeah. Dheeraj.
Yes!
Great. Welcome, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it is really awesome that that you could join us. Also, slightly short notice. Unfortunately, one speaker was not able to make it, but put me in contact with Dheeraj and Timothy from the Static Web App team themselves, which is just awesome to have them here today. And I guess, let's have a look. We're about 3 minutes early.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question, if you don't mind, that we got from a previous session.
Sure.
Because we're trying to start each session on the hour, so people joining on the hour know there's a session. So I'm trying not to start early if possible.
Understood. Yep.
The question was from Abbas Alwash. A question about, do you know when the Azure Static Web App Hybrid SSR Next.js preview will be moved to production? We really need it in our company.
That's a lot of words.
That's a lot of words. Very important question, though. I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that is very, that's a big ask from our customers. So we are looking to move it to production fairly quickly. We're just working out our final little issues, whatnot. It is stable right now. So it has the preview tag. We haven't removed the preview tag just yet, but it is stable and can be used for our production workload. Right now, we are going to remove that preview tag hopefully early next year.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. So, Abbas, I hope that answers your question. And yeah, we've just had the session on the data API builder, which is also in preview at the moment. So hopefully at some point soon, that's also going to go GA, because that's another fantastic piece of functionality.
That is the hope. So we are planning on trying to move database connections to GA shortly after we figure out our story for next. And then obviously the biggest thing in the room right now is dedicated, which we are hoping to GA again early next year. So after we're able to GA those things, we'll move on and figure out our timeline for database connections.
Yeah, so you've got a lot of stuff going on at the moment then.
Yeah, exciting stuff. I hope everyone's ready to use them. If you have any feedback, feel free to leave it in our GitHub repo, especially with these preview features, so we understand what is going to be necessary for us to take these things to GA in a usable fashion for everyone.
Awesome. I really appreciate it. I really love the fact that the static web app themselves, from the word go, it was fantastic, but it's just been growing and growing over the last few years. And the shortcuts that you had to take when it was in preview back in 2021, before the SWA CLI came along, all of those shortcuts disappeared. We now have stuff to work with, which is what you're going to be showing us today. And it's just getting more and more mature as we go along. And it's really becoming such a powerful resource within Azure to quickly get stuff up and running with lots of different combinations of backends, etc. So
happy to hear that. Yeah.
And I think on that note, we are on the hour. So do we have a screen that we need to share?
Yep. Let me go ahead and share mine real quick. Let's see if this will do it properly.
Here we go.
Through it.
Okay, cool. So we have that. If we need to switch to Timothy's machine, just let me know, and we'll get that done from the green room. Just say it on stream and we'll hear it. And with that,
Absolutely.
Take it away. Thank you both.
Take care.
Yeah, so I'm going to quickly go over some slides to introduce the SWA CLI and exactly what differentiates it from maybe the other local dev tools that are offered within Azure. And then I'll pass it off to Tim to go over actually using it. So yeah, the Azure Static Web Apps CLI. So to install it, it is an NPM package. You can find it at that npm.js link. Just look up Static Web Apps CLI. If a functions backend is used, it will automatically also install the functions core tools emulator. So you're able to run locally anything that has a functions backend with your SWA running locally as well. So it's really easy to set up. We really have three things you can do with the CLI. You can create static web apps, you can manage static web apps, and then you can deploy static web apps. And all of those things Tim is going to go through and show you in live today. And then we have documentation. So for configuration settings, some of the biggest things about the SWA CLI is that we do have a framework detection, which is similar to the one that's found in the portal, where the SWA CLI can detect and set your framework-specific details, but you can also customize that in the SWA CLI config file, much like the static web apps config JSON. You can create build commands and dev server variables that can be manually set and adjusted so that you can locally emulate your entire application. Let's see. So looking at this, the first step, like I said, was creating a new static web app. You can initialize a project directly from SWA CLI. This would set up your deployment. You don't have to come in with anything besides your Azure subscription. For local testing and development, this is really where the SWA CLI shines. We have a couple important emulations that, can save you a lot of time before you go to production. The first one is, I just heard you guys are coming from the Data API Builder session. If you have a database connections, you can test it locally, and we're going to show you how to do that today. Without having to deploy your entire code base, you can make real calls to your database using the SWA CLI. You can also check the health of your database connection and just make sure that the actual connection works. There are a couple steps afterwards that you'd have to set in order for it to be connected in production, but this really does save you a lot of time instead of having to wait for multiple deployments to figure out if the changes you made on the database connection actually worked. In the same fashion, if you have a functions backend, we're able to emulate that as well without having to deploy. Again, going back to those configuration settings, you can set your functions backend as a configuration detail, and you can run that locally. And we will use functions core tools to emulate it, and it'll all be linked up. And finally, we have authentication emulation, which Tim has been working on recently a lot, because we're trying to bring more than just the built-in auth. We're trying to bring in some of the custom authentication options to emulate. But for example, if you have AAD or GitHub auth set up on your app and you want to test how that looks, you can go ahead and do that using SWA CLI. You can also set roles, user roles, and ensure that everything that needs to be protected with authentication is protected. Finally, you can deploy to Azure. You don't have to take it to GitHub or Azure DevOps. You can deploy directly from SWA CLI, which is something a lot of customers generally ask. If you don't want to set up a CI/CD, deploying directly from SWA CLI is an option, and it's a good one. It works. That being said, troubleshooting and best practices. If any issues do arise, there's actually a separate GitHub repo called the Static Web Apps CLI that we specifically monitor to help make improvements on the CLI. So if you have any issues, please go ahead and open up an issue on that repo. And besides that, I guess one thing that we wanted to flag right now is we're currently addressing a couple bugs. Like I mentioned, Tim is opening up the ability to emulate more auth options currently. So that's going to be coming out real soon. And then we're also addressing a bug regarding the deployment of an API from the SWA CLI. All right. Is there anything you want to add, Tim?
No, I think that hits all the major points.
Awesome. I'm going to pass it over to you then.
All righty. Me. Okay. Let me know when y'all are able to see my terminal here.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So like Dheeraj had mentioned, the SWA CLI, our main beefy component here is the ability to emulate what you would expect in production. So managed functions is one of the features that Azure Static Web Apps does offer. And so today I'm going to go through a very, albeit crude, example. I'm going to make a very simple React application, a very simple Azure function, and we're going to go through all the different components that Dheeraj had discussed. And along the way, I'm happy to open it up to questions. I can't exactly see the chat right now, so Stace, Eric, or Dheeraj, if you see any questions, please feel free to stop me, and I'm happy to take it from there. Alrighty. So starting, I'm just going to make a new, let me open this up here. I'm going to make a new directory. And so let's say I am a developer. I'm going to make something, I want to make a React single page application, and I want to allow users to log in through one of the SWA authentication methods. So through AAD, GitHub, or some of the other custom auths that are coming in the future. And we would like to allow the user to make calls to our backend manage function, and as well as the database connection as well. So starting from here, I am going to, sorry about that. I'm going to create a new Vite package. So let's make the application. And I'm going to have this going in parallel just because sometimes this can be a little finicky. My Azure DevBox was not cooperating, even though I prayed heavily to the demo gods this morning. All right, so in parallel, I'm going to make a Azure function. So I'm going to init using, this is not our product, by the way, this is the Azure Functions, the CLI at this point. So I'm going to make a node function, JavaScript, and here it's going to start installing the dependencies that's required. So on this side, in the first terminal, I'm making my front end in Vite, and I'm going to name it, I'm just going to name it app for now. We're going to do it in React, JavaScript, nice and easy, and I'm going to start installing the dependencies here as well. Let me just get that out of the way. Okay. So as we wait here, my current folder hierarchy is I have two folders, my API folder and app folder. At this point, the SWA CLI hasn't come into play yet, but I am a full stack developer. I'm just constructing my front end, back end connections for now. And here we see in the front end side, we have a very simple Vite bootstrapped application. So if I come in here and I do npm run dev, this will fire up. Localhost 5173 gets exposed to me. And once this loads, boom, I see a splash screen, Vite and React. And this is very simple, like get started with Vite, glad you're here sort of thing. And on the other side, in my other terminal here, if we look under the API, here we have the bootstrapped Azure function files that we would see once it's initialized. So we see a host JSON, we see a package JSON with the Azure Functions dependency already installed within Node modules. So starting from here, now I have my API scaffolding set up, I can create a new function. So I'm going to do func new and give it these parameters. So I give it a name, and I'm going to create a very, very simple HTTP trigger Azure function for now. So just like that, it's created, and in the API hierarchy, I can see a new function, HTTP example JS. So all this is doing at this point is if I were to call whatever is hosting this Azure function /API/HTTP example, if I use a get or post method, all that's going to happen, we have a context logging message, and we will see hello world coming back, because this function now is looking in the query. If a name was provided, it'll say hello Tim if I were to provide that, or if we don't provide that, then it just falls back to hello world. So again, this is coming from the Azure function CLI tool, but if I were to do func start, then this kicks off their emulator. So now we see it got fired. Localhost 7071/API/HTTP example will now show hello world. So what's going on now is I have started on this screen, I have the Azure Function CLI emulating our hello world HTTP trigger. On this tab, I have a Vite npm run dev. Now, this is where the SWA CLI is going to come into play. Now, we know that based on a folder hierarchy like this, we have an app folder, we have an API folder. If I were to put this into a GitHub repository, into an Azure DevOps repo, and I were to create a SWA through the portal, we would then have the language detection framework kick in, and it would recognize, okay, I see an app folder. I see that it is React version 18 or whatever I started it to, and I see an API folder with an Azure function in it that's running node 16 or 18. And from there, it's going to create all the deployment scaffolding. And once we get that content distributed to all of our region centers, at that point, when I hit my SWA's default host name, then I will see the front end screen. And then if I were to take that default host name and then go to /API/HTTP example, then it automatically gets routed to this custom made Azure function that I created. So in a nutshell, that's what managed backends is doing for you. We take care of the function deployment, and we will return you one default host name where you can access the front end, and then you can just slap /API/whatever to the back of it, and we will properly route it to the function that was created for you. So I'm jumping way ahead here. Now let's go back to reality for a little bit. And from here, looking at what I have, again, 2 folders, app and API. And so at this point, I'm going to run SWA init. So now we're entering the world of the SWA CLI. This method, very simply put, it traverses the current root directory. It does the language detection. It will create the SWA CLI config JSON file that Dheeraj mentioned just a few moments ago. And from there, that's going to construct the blueprinting for our emulation, our building, and the eventual deployment into your Azure ecosystem. And so we see, welcome to Static Web App CLI. And yeah, let's go ahead, call this live. And here we see what I was just saying. We have this language detection framework that knows, okay, I'm using Vite and I have a Node.js API. And it traverses, it's able to differentiate what is my app folder, where's the output location going to be. So after I run npm run build, by default, if we look in package.json, by default, Vite is going to package it all into the dist folder, the distribution. Maybe it's here. Sorry, I haven't worked in front end in quite a bit. Yeah, maybe it's just defaulted by Vite. It's going to go into the distribution folder, and we see that the API is running node 16. We see the build commands, we see the dev server commands, and we see where the dev server URL is going to be. So if you remember when I ran npm run div, it fired up the Vite website onto localhost 5173. But what's going to happen later when we use emulator, it's going to expose a different port, which actually then is going to proxy to localhost 5173 where V is running, and it'll proxy the API request into the function port that's exposed. And this is essentially what happens in SWA's production environment as well. So we wanted to capture as close to production as we could to ease developers in, setting up this sandbox environment, if you will. And so looking at this, I'm going to say settings are correct. And just like that, we see a SWA CLI config JSON that was created with everything that was just displayed previously. And now we see get started following commands, very, very straightforward. SWA start. This is the command that is going to kick off that emulation that I was just saying. And very clearly, we do see a warning. This is important to keep in mind that we try to match our production environment as closely as possible. However, anything can happen, right? So we have to be careful about that. Things may differ slightly than what you do expect. However, with the emulator started, now we see that the emulation has exposed port 4280 to us. And what's going on here is once we fire this up, the Vite application has started in the backend, and 4280 is simply proxying to 5173, whatever Vite is hosting on. And if you remember, we had /API/HTTP example. So on the same exact port here, I can go to /API/HTTP example, and I see hello world. I see the Azure function that I created earlier. And what's even more neat is that we do have the ability to hot reload. So let's do a change into the backend. If I do a refresh here, just like that, I see the change, and needless to say, front end as well, but we'll have plenty of time to show that. So one of the first things I'd like to jump into here is looking at the front end. One of the things that we want customers to do within the SWA CLI is to simulate authentication. Because when we are writing these single page applications, I know I've done it in the past, we want to check authentication as well as authorization. So let's say we have a website, there's a navigation bar, we see our standard home, about us, FAQ, and we want to do something like, okay, if this user is an admin, let's give them some more admin titles on the navigation bar. So maybe they can see manage site, or they can see manage users. So when it comes to local development, we try to make it as easy as possible within the SWA CLI, where we expose a 2 or 3 really authentication endpoints that's accessible, and we can simulate. So let me just show this here. I'm just going to create a new section on the front page here, and I'm going to add a button where on click, we will navigate the user to, it will be sorry, fingers are a bit cold in Seattle this morning. We're going to auth, login, and let's use Azure Active Directory as an example. But again, we do provide GitHub and future ones as well. But in this example, I'm going to do AAD. And then quite simply, I'm going to make a login button, and let's do a state as well. Or before I jump there, let me just show what this is going to look like. So hot reloaded, we have this new login button. So on click, I'm going to get navigated to this. This is all bundled within the SWA CLI package itself. So here we know the provider is AAD, user ID, this is just randomly generated ID, and username. I can do that, and user roles by default, all SWA authentication will, once you are logged in through enter Azure Active Directory or GitHub, you will have anonymous and authenticated on it. So auth and anonymous will be added automatically if not provided. So this is the kind of page that we'll see in the emulation, of course. Once we're in production, I'll show after deployment. When we're in production and we hit this site, it's going to bring you to the Microsoft login screen that you see that you expect. And then after that, you'll grant consent to the SWA. And once you do grant consent to have your Microsoft email shared with the owner of the static web app, you'll then be authenticated from there. But for the sake of testing here, I'm going to make user roles, and we will make a state of what the user roles are looking like. So let's see, right under here, let's make a paragraph. And if we have user roles, or then we show no login info yet. And coming back to here, I said we had a few auth endpoints that are available from the SWA CLI. And another one is when you go to the emulation endpoint, you can go to /auth/me. And what this site is going to show you, or it's more of an API endpoint, right? What calling this is going to show you is, am I logged in? And what are my roles? At this point, I haven't been logged in yet. So I'm going to see client principal null. So this is a way for the single page application SWAs to programmatically check, is the user logged in? What are the user's roles? So I'm going to make a very simple function here. I'm going to do a use effect, which on render of this React application, I'm going to call, let's name it get roles. And writing the get roles function, it's going to be async, and we are going to fetch that endpoint that I had just shown. So we will fetch .auth/me. And let's convert this to text. It's also possible to convert it into JSON, and then we can manipulate it further. But for the time being, I'm going to just convert it to text, and we will set the state to what was returned here. Perfect. So now coming back to here, we see login. Okay, client principal is null. This is how programmatically I'm going to know, all right, this user isn't logged in yet. So whatever admin controls we want to show, let's hide it. We don't want that displayed yet. Now I'm going to log in, pre-generated username, and these are the two generated roles by default. And I'm going to hit login. So this is all simulated at this point. What SWA does, even in production, is upon logging in to some identity provider, we will create a cookie with all the OAuth roles that were returned. And that cookie is going to be shared in your current session. And here we see, okay, now when I hit /auth/me, we try to read the cookie from your browser and then decrypt it, which will tell us, okay, this user is part of what principal, their claims, what identity provider, and their roles. So coming back to here, now we see, okay, now this user is authenticated. Maybe now we can show this is your feed, this is the operations that you can do. And furthermore, let's say I even put an admin, and that's how we can check is this user is an admin. Let's show the management screens like we'd expect to. And so again, this is a really easy way for developers to play around. And I can always come in here and let's say, okay, I want to be an admin. And now admin will be part of my /auth/me request. So like that, we allow emulation. When it comes to production, it gets a little bit more tricky because you actually have to assign those roles and send out invite links and such. So this is somewhat of a sandbox, help developers test every single edge case or every single pathway that customers may encounter. So that is our authentication simulation that I wanted to show. Up next, I am going to show the API call. So I'm going to make another card here. And on click, let's do get API. And we are going to call the API on click. And I'm going to make a new state later. And no API result yet. Okay. So let's make the API state set API result. We will initialize it to undefined, just like the user roles. And very, very similarly, we're going to have get API, which is going to be an async function on button click, where we are going to fetch /API/HTTP example, which is the Azure function that I created time ago. And I'll convert it to text again, just like this, nice and simple. And we will set API result to text. So just like that, hot reloaded, we see no API result yet. And let me go into the inspector and we can even look at the network tab here. So once I hit this button, it makes the call to, where is it? We make the call to /API/HTTP example on the same hostname, 4280. So this is the emulation that when we make a /API, when the path starts with /API, then it gets rerouted to our Azure function managed backend. So like that, we see hello world, hot reload. This was the content that was responded. So I'm converting it into text and boom, just like that, we display it on our React application. So, you know, when it comes to Azure static web apps, the whole idea is a static site is something that displays images, text, and it's your single page application, right? But what makes a static web app is linking that with some sort of backend, whether it's a function that we manage, like a managed Azure function, or you can link a backend as well. And that's what makes the power behind your applications, right? You will allow users to log in and users can interact with databases and all sorts of things from there, which is a great segue into one of the final pieces of this live demo here is a database connection. So what I had done before this demo is I created a NoSQL Cosmos DB that I will bring up here. This is a very simple NoSQL Cosmos database, nothing flashy. Created it under my subscription, and I created a test person database and a test person container. And this is a good time to show this API example here. So Microsoft Learn has a lot of good documentations on how we can create a database connection within static web apps. And on this page here, this is a Cosmos DB example. We have MySQL, SQL, Postgres, and this is all using the data API builder that the last session was about. And going back to the portal, we can create an Azure Cosmos DB, and let's see, from the keys? On the keys tab, we have a primary connection string. So for security reasons, I'm not going to show this, but the connection string is this URL that will get you access into connecting to this Cosmos database. And it's required for the data API builder as well as the SWA CLI emulator to form that connection in your local development. And when it comes to production, all of this is done for you on behalf of certain managed identities. So we take care of all of that for you in production. But for development, we do need the primary connection string inside of an environment file, which I will show the setup later. And just showing the Cosmos DB I set up, very, very simple. I followed the tutorial here, and I have a person database, person container, and I have one person in there right now, myself, with an ID of 1. So now going back to here, I have this application. I want to make another button. And when I click that button, I want to make a call to the database that I set up in real time. So when I make a change to my Cosmos DB in Portal, I'd like to see it reflected on this as well. So how we can do this is I am going to kill my CLI emulation, and we have a command. So SWA DB init. This is going to initialize our DB connections folder as well as some configuration files that are needed to start that setup. So I have a NoSQL database type, and I give it my database name, my test person database. Upon doing this, it's going to spin for a little bit, and soon enough, we should see a new SWAD-DB connections folder coming up. And in the meantime, I will show this. This is an example of an EMV file that you would need to get this set up. So Azure Subscription ID and Tenant ID, this is auto-populated when you do AZ login or SWA login, but we do need to provide the database connection string. And this is the primary connection string that I was showing earlier. And this, now that it's loaded, you can see this is used in our database config JSON here. The connection string, this should be, hold on, I'm sorry. This did not initialize properly. I told you all, I can only pray so hard to the demo gods. What it's supposed to look like is this. Let me bring this over here. Oh, you know what? That's right. It's not part of the init. It's actually part of the tutorial here. So the tutorial, it tells you, okay, create a database connection string in the EMV file, initialize what we just did, and then it says, okay, paste this into your GraphQL schema file. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the same thing, paste that in here. So this is our person model, and it's going to return the ID and name, which we saw in my Cosmos DB before. And we're going to paste this into our database config JSON. So I'm going to, all right, just like this. And now here we see where the connection string is populated. So it's going to read from my environment file, database connection string. So at this point, let me get my actual environment file, and I'm going to paste it into there. And we are going to rename this to .env. And now it will be picked up from my environment file, and I will be able to query my test person database, my test person container, and using this GraphQL schema, it's going to return me the ID and name. So now that the scaffolding is set up for SWA CLI to connect to our database, all I have to do is I'm going to go into my React application, and I'm going to create a new function. So this time we are going to get DB. It's going to be another async function. And let me just copy and paste this from the tutorial. This is the query we're going to use.
One quick thing I wanted to point out here, Tim just put in the schema into the schema file because he's specifically doing the example with Cosmos. If it wasn't a NoSQL database, we would be extracting the schema as well. So that would be a step you wouldn't have to do because you ran the DB in it. But yeah,
correct. Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, so we try to make it as simple as possible again, but looking at a bunch of the tutorials is a fantastic starting point. There are so many different types that you can get started on, and they all follow roughly the same setup here. So Microsoft Learn is great. Stace, I don't know if there's any way to provide links, maybe in the chat. I can figure out after I'm done presenting. I'm happy to send that wherever.
Yep, we can do that. If you let me know the links, I can put them into the chat so that it goes out.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, let's do that. That's perfect. Okay. Yeah. So coming back to here, I've created the database function here, async method. This is the GraphQL query, and we are going to call the endpoint /data API /GraphQL, and this will all get linked. So coming down to here, let's create one more card. I am nearing the end. I'm being mindful of my time here. And on click, we will get DB. And this will be call Cosmos DB. And same thing as before, we're going to do DB result or no DB result yet. Very simple, straightforward. Now, let's go back to here, and I will open up the inspector. Let's reload. Of course. I killed it, so I'm going to rerun SWA start. Oh, but this time once we have a DB connection, we need to add one more additional flag into there. So we have data API location, and we have to specify what folder our config JSON and schemas are in. So it's just one additional little thing. And I kick that off. And here we see everything should be fired up, waiting, and we are ready on 4280. So on refresh, let us see. I'm going to go to the network tab here. And okay. And now we see the new button that I created, call Cosmos DB. And we don't have a database result yet, so I'm going to click it. And here we see a pending request to /data API /GraphQL. And the response is the containers or the items that I had created in my test person container. So we see ID 1, name is Tim. So just to show in real time as well, let's make a new item. And this time we are going to do ID of 2, and let's do a name of Dheeraj. Let's get him in this database too. So save. Now that it's in the database, I'm going to call it one more time, and boom, just like that, we see the second name. So this is all real-time database connections that we're able to test in real time in a development environment before we even productionize it. So very cool. From this point, the SWA emulator, we have been able to hot reload. We've been able to call our managed function backend. We're able to simulate authentication. And now we have hooked up a database connection inside of my Azure ecosystem. So now coming back, we're going to round it up, tie it in a very nice bow here. I'm going to deploy this into my Azure ecosystem. So we've done everything. We've done SWA start, SWA init, SWA start, DB init. So finally, at this point, I'm going to do SWA build. And what build is going to do is inside of the CLI config, we know this is our application, this is our API location, and it's going to go in each of those, install the dependencies, and run the build commands. So npm run build, npm run build for both of them, and it's going to package it nicely for deployment. And so from this point, it should have been built. And let me just make sure. Yes. Okay. And now from here, this is what Dheeraj was kind of alluding to before. We have a known issue that we are trying to resolve, that we will resolve here. The SWA deployment is going to fail if I include this API location in it. So for the time being, I'm going to remove API location, and we're going to pretend that I don't have an API to deploy just yet. Through the CLI, what's going on is we are throwing a validation failure because it's recognizing, hey, this API folder is too big. And it's like, I wonder why it's so big, but it's because node modules is included in it. All the dependencies were installed, and we're trying to upload that to our deployment client, and it's coming out to like 400 megabytes, and that's just throwing up flags on our side. So we are going to create a fix that is able to differentiate, okay, if I'm deploying from SWA CLI, everything is already built. So we need to allow the CLI to upload larger files. So worry not, that is coming down the pipeline. So I'm going to go into my portal, and there are many ways to deploy it through the CLI, but I'm going to do it kind of manually through the portal. I'm going to create a new SWA, and let me put it in my SWA day resource group. And I'm going to call it live demo SWA standard. And for the deployment source, I'm going to choose other. And I think we can go through the rest, staging environments, everything like that is okay. And let's create it. So by choosing an other provider, it's not going to ask me, what is your GitHub repo? What is your DevOps repo? And in this case, I'm going to manually deploy it using a deployment token. So here it is, my new resource is created. I see the default host name coming here. Congratulations on your new site. It's just waiting for a deployment. So I'm going to go to manage deployment token. I'm going to copy this, and let's go back to my live demo, and I am going to, let me log in first. So I'm going to do a SWA login in my SWA Day resource group, and the live demo SWA is the app name I chose, right? Yep. So I'm going to SWA log into that. And after this, I can finally deploy it. And at this point, everything has been built because I ran the SWA build command already. Let's see. Let me close this out. And it's going to check my Azure settings, make sure that I'm in my subscription and correct tenant. And I'm going to do SWA deploy, and I'm going to supply the deployment token that I had just copied over. So that token tells them, okay, that is a valid user that can deploy to live demo SWA, and we see the kickoff starting. So it's deploying project to Azure Static Web Apps, and it's just going to start spinning in progress. And it's going to start polling. So at this point, our SWA client is now distributing the content to all of our region centers. And very quickly, we see the project has been successfully deployed. So let's open it up. And just like that, now we're able to see it. This is the API is not going to work because I did not include that. And we have one more additional step for call Cosmos DB, but I'll get to that in a second. I want to show this. Now, this login, if you remember, was bringing us to /auth/login AAD. Now, in the simulator, we saw that splash screen where we can input what roles we want, whatever. But in this case, in a production environment, we actually link it to the Microsoft Azure Active Directory login. So now I can choose my Microsoft account. And like I was saying before, we have a consent page. So if you choose to log in with your Microsoft account, you must grant consent that you're sharing your email address, your username to this Azure Static Web App. So I'm going to consent. And here we see, boom, now I'm logged in, AAD, that is my Microsoft email, and my roles of anonymous and authenticated. So that is the difference. In the SWA CLI, we're able to emulate it. In production, that's the real deal. That's it. So finally, the one last thing is the database connection. So if I come back here and I choose to call the Cosmos DB, it's not going to, it's going to 500 because we need to set up this connection where the Cosmos database recognizes, okay, this static web app is allowed to call my database. So because I deployed to a preview environment, I'm going to link. I did a Cosmos NoSQL resource group, CLI resource group, and the test database here. My test person database through a connection string. So I'm going to acknowledge, and we're going to link successfully connected a database, just like that. Oh no, sorry about that. Let me refresh here, clear this out, and when I call the Cosmos database, now the call is in flight and it comes back. So just like that, we were successfully able to emulate it on the SWA CLI, making the call to the database, and then do it in a production or preview environment at this point. This was a very rudimentary example of the database connection. There's a lot more that you can do. You can CRUD, but in this case, all I did was a simple get. But this Microsoft tutorial, which I'll send over to Stace, has tons and tons of examples. It'll show you how to list, how to get by ID, update, as well as delete. So anything your heart could ever desire from there. And with that, I believe I'm right on time. Sorry about that. I'm happy to take any questions.
You are perfectly on time. That's awesome. We have one question from the audience. For deployment to production, would I use the Azure Developer CLI or the SWA CLI?
So I can answer that, and then Tim, feel free to add in anything. It really depends. Both of those are completely valuable tools. I think the biggest thing that we're showing you with the SWA CLI is the local emulation feature that you're not going to get with the Azure Developer CLI. What Tim showed you, where you could test the database connections, functions, and auth, while not deploying is the main like get that you get from SWAT CLI. We have published recently documentation on how to create a resource from Azure in Bicep using for Azure SWA. And so you can use that to integrate and use Azure Developer CLI to deploy. And Tim just showed you how to do it with SWAT CLI. So both are completely valid ways to do it. Yeah, just depends on what your local testing needs are before you deploy.
Exactly. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can go with that. I mean, this is part of what I'm putting in the book, and I have a talk going through deploying from a pipeline completely. So infrastructure as code. And I generally find from my use case in that a mixture of AZ static web app and the SWA CLI are using both of them at appropriate times makes life just a whole lot easier.
Yeah. A lot of the samples that are out there will use AZD just because they include a lot of different Azure resources. So definitely if you want to go see an example of how that's done, there's a lot on Azure samples.
Yeah. So it's go look at all of the awesome MS-Learn documentation. There's a lot of great stuff out there. And yeah, we don't have a lot of time, but I really did just want to say thank you for all of the stuff that you've done. And really thank you for putting a node function in there. Because I think over today we've seen Blazor front ends, we've seen React, we've seen Angular, but everybody's been using C# backends. And I love the fact that you've showcased here it's we support different things.
Exactly. Yeah. We don't judge.
Yeah. So what are the options right now? Because I know it used to be a little bit limited. It wasn't everything that you could do on for an Azure function. So that's
a good question. I just spoke with Dheeraj about this previously. We do have a static web app page that shows all of the functions that we are able to manage.
Mm-hmm. We have support for everything in function v3 and v4, I believe.
Okay.
And so I'll send that link over. This is the language runtime. Is that what you're referring to? I think
we may have
just. I think Dheeraj just sent us the Learn link. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Then I will drop that one in to the chat right now as well. Then.
Yeah.
And then we have. Yeah, so thanks. That's what I was leaning towards. SLA CLI for local. Then we have a comment from Fuse Enable, but I'm everything including intercal. I'm guessing not for the Azure functions.
I think you got us there. Azure functions might handle that though. And if that's the case, we do welcome linked backends as well. As always, you can bring your own function, link it to your static web app.
Yeah. Okay, so on that note, I am going to say thank you to you both for joining us. It's been fantastic. That was, when we were talking about this earlier, kind of what I hoped that you were going to be able to show us. So superb. Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. And enjoy the rest of the day because you guys are across the pond. So it's middle of the day for you now?
Yep.
Just about, yep.
Yeah, so have a great afternoon.
Thank you very much. Awesome. Have a wonderful night. And thanks again for having us.
Yep, you're welcome. Thanks for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye.